The first of the communications, Mr. Speaker, will be a communication on VAT. Rhetorically, the question has been asked, where has the money gone from VAT? Mr. Speaker, I propose to answer it comprehensively this morning, to put it on public record this morning, and to follow it up with the creation of a website, Mr. Speaker, that the public will be able to access. Mr. Speaker, prior to the 2012 general election, my government proposed in its Charter for Governance the most comprehensive and transformative program of structural change in the history of our nation, with a view to enhancing the economic and social prospects for all Bahamians. During our current mandate, we have diligently pursued the implementation of a program of change. In doing so, we acknowledged that given its breadth and depth all across areas of society and government, this program represented more than a 5-year agenda of action geared to the traditional election cycle. Our focus has therefore not been narrowly centered on short-term gains geared to the political cycle, since such victories, by their very nature, invariably fail to survive the test of time. To the contrary, we have over the past 5 years steadfastly maintained a policy focus on the fundamental and durable long-term economic and social objectives articulated in our Charter for Governance. When we came to office in 2012, we quickly discovered the extent to which our public finances had been allowed to deteriorate during the previous administration's mandate. We were therefore clear from the outset that redressing the public finances was a primordial requirement for securing and improving an improved future for our citizens. In other words, a fiscally sustainable government is a fundamentally necessary condition for the advancement and development of our economy and society. Mr. Speaker, there has been much conversation that the government promoted VAT as a mechanism to reduce the debt, and the government has reneged on this commitment. This line of communication is misguided. To repay debt, the government must first address the root cause of continued debt accumulation. If we spend more than we earn, we must borrow. Mr. Speaker, if we spend more than we earn, then we are required to borrow. When we came in, we found that the other side was spending over $500 million more than we were earning, so we had to borrow. We were spending, Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated, more than $500 million than we earned in 2012. Today, we have reduced this excessive spending over earnings to an average of less than $400 million, and excluding natural disasters, to an average of less than $250 million. Therefore, debt accumulation has decelerated. And I want to be able to say it again, Mr. Speaker. But for the hurricanes impacting the Bahamas, Mr. Speaker, we would have had a reduction to an average of less than $250 million. And therefore, we conclude, and we put into the public domain, that debt accumulation has decelerated. Mr. Speaker, we accomplished this reduction by developing and introducing early in our term a detailed medium-term fiscal consolidation plan that is designed to bring order to the public finances and gradually lead to lower levels of government debt in a balanced and targeted fashion, with policy action in respect of both expenditure and revenue. The medium-term fiscal consolidation plan includes plans to further enhance revenues while enabling economic growth and expenditure, with break-even projection for financial year 2018-2019. Surpluses are projected thereafter, and the decline in debt would be observed. If there were deficiency for fully articulating this clearly, the government accepts this criticism and is now laying out the full account of how VAT would repay the debt. Any financial person or purported financial person that suggests there was reasonable expectation that debt levels would decline immediately with the implementation of VAT is being disingenuous at best and deceitful at worst. The world is watching us. Let us therefore demonstrate our collective intelligence and not our selfish motives when we discuss our fiscal affairs. Our general public expects nothing less. Every agency in the world examines us, the International Monetary Fund, the rating agencies. We are looked at, we are watched, we are measured. Therefore, let us intelligently discuss our fiscal affairs. Mr. Speaker, in line with the medium-term fiscal consolidation plan, the government has implemented the most fundamental and progressive reform of the fiscal and tax systems in the history of the nation. This program of reform has been a resounding success in producing the significant improvement in the revenue yield for our tax system that is vitally necessary to support sound and sustainable fiscal policies, including deficit and ultimately debt reduction, and improving modern governance in the Bahamas. The cornerstone of tax reform has been the implementation of a value-added tax that was thoroughly designed, planned, and implemented after the widest public consultation and on the basis of expert international advice, as well as best practice and experience with VAT systems in a number of other countries. This process of consultation on VAT was the most progressive act of collaboration between, one, the private sector, that is the creator of economic activity, and two, the general public that must bear the cost of taxes but ultimately benefit from the programs that taxes enable this government to provide. And three, your government of the Bahamas that is tasked with enabling an environment for economic prosperity while ensuring that what is done is to be for the least of us, benefiting the royalty, while ensuring that what is done for the least of us, whilst at the same time even benefiting the royalty amongst us. So, Mr. Speaker, which practically means in everyday language, Mr. Speaker, that VAT is intended to serve the interests of every citizen of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, notwithstanding their stations as they differ in life. The consultations included the provision of time for the private sector to research alternatives that it had proposed, principally payroll tax as well as VAT. Their own research not only supported VAT, but it was empirically demonstrated to those that had doubts that such implementation would not doom the economy. The research also enabled the private sector to make recommendations on the rate of VAT, which was then promulgated to be 7.5%. The private sector spoke also and made contributions on the limitations on exemptions. All of these matters were comprehensively discussed, and the private sector lent its overt support for the implementation of the VAT system and the education of the general public. Mr. Speaker, is there ever a previous time when such public-private sector partnership has been so vibrant? My government maintained responsibility, but employed the collective wisdom of the stakeholders in the country. As a result, the Bahamian VAT was introduced in an impressively smooth fashion, and the tax has generated a more buoyant stream of revenue than had originally been expected. Over the first 2 full years of its existence, the VAT has produced some $1.1 billion in gross revenues. This, in turn, has contributed to an important improvement, as desired and planned, in the revenue yield of our tax system from 17.2% of GDP in 2013-2014 to a projected 23.7% of GDP for this fiscal year in the last budget. Such a level for the revenue yield is more in line with that in other regional and first world economies and more suitable to modern governance in the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, in introducing VAT, we expressly stated that we would, based on collections experience with the new VAT, introduce reductions in other taxes to the extent feasible. Let me say it again. In introducing VAT, we made it specifically clear to all that we would, based on collections experience with the new VAT, introduce reductions in other taxes to the extent feasible. We have therefore been crystal clear that our program of tax reform, including the introduction of VAT in 2015, has manifold objectives. Firstly, tax reform and VAT per se, as a new source of revenue, have unquestionably been targeted to secure a significant improvement in the public finances of the country through, for example, lower levels of GFS deficit and ultimately lower levels of government debt. Second, tax reform, including VAT, has been designed to produce an appreciable improvement and stability in the revenue yield of our tax system, enabling the government to more effectively and sustainably finance modern programs and services for our citizens. By stability, I am referring to improvement and consistency in collection rates, as VAT has the highest compliance rate of any tax system in the Bahamas, and by capturing the broadest base to be taxed, no goods or services are excluded with limited exceptions. Thirdly, the VAT. The VAT specifically, as a new revenue source, has been instrumental in facilitating reductions in the tax burdens of consumers and businesses in respect of the other major taxes, which I identify later in this communication. So as I make the point, Mr. Speaker, that we specifically explained to the Bahamian people that as our experience matured with VAT and the collections of VAT, we would begin the reduction of other forms of taxation that Bahamians were required to pay. I will identify them in this communication and be full. Fourthly, VAT was introduced as a central component of our tax reform plan, as it has been shown to be more supportive of stronger economic growth and job creation as compared to other tax policy alternatives. Mr. Speaker, in light of the central role of VAT in the government's program of tax reform and its impressive success in generating much-needed new revenues, it does not come as a surprise that the VAT has garnered a good deal of public attention and public discussion since its introduction, and especially in recent months. Accordingly, the principal objective of this communication is to bring clarity to the main issue in respect of the VAT that has featured prominently in public discussions, and that is, how has the VAT revenue been utilized? How has the VAT revenue been utilized? This is essentially a question about financial transparency and accountability, both of which are of vital importance to modern democratic governance. These are issues that most definitely need to be addressed and clarified for the benefit of our citizens, and this communication addresses these issues. Mr. Speaker, I turn to VAT revenues. In reviewing the matter of VAT, I will begin with the issue of transparency and accountability in the public finances, and specifically in respect of VAT revenues. The simple truth of the matter is that the Constitution of the Bahamas, the Financial Administration and Audit Act, and our various programs and revenue laws provide for the transparent accounting of all government expenditure and the collection, accounting for, and utilization of every single dollar of revenue. Now, as well, the government's budget provides an annual statement on detailed expenditure and revenue plans for the coming fiscal year, as well as data on actual outturns for both expenditure and revenue for recent prior years. According to Article 128 of the Constitution, all revenues of the country are to be paid into the consolidated fund. All revenues of the country are to be paid into the consolidated fund. As such, revenues from any one source are to be indistinguishable from revenue from any other source. It all goes and commingles in one fund. Faithful to this article of the Constitution, the value-added tax specifically stipulates in Section 12(9) that all VAT revenues collected will be credited to the consolidated fund, and none are therefore to be earmarked for any specific purpose. That is the law of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. VAT revenues are thus commingled with all other revenues in the consolidated fund, and therefore are but one component of the government's fiscal plans that are presented to Parliament every year, and as such, they contribute to the financing of the government's expenditure and also contribute to the attainment of the government's key fiscal objectives in respect of eliminating the GFS deficit over time and reducing the level of government debt to comfortable levels of the past. Mr. Speaker, in the context of the discussion of the allocation of VAT revenues to the consolidated fund and the subsequent utilization of monies from the fund for the purpose of public expenditure, it is also important to note that Article 136 of the Constitution provides for the office of the Auditor General, appointed by the Governor General, to audit annually the accounts of the government and prepare a report, and for audits to be tabled in the House of Assembly. Importantly, the Auditor General shall not be subject to the direction or control of any person or authority in the preparation of his audits and reports. In addition, the Financial Administration and Audit Act contains clear provisions in respect of fiscal accountability and transparency. It is by law. So, Mr. Speaker, the question arises of how the government has chosen in the development of its annual fiscal plans to make use of the additional revenues that have accrued from VAT. In simple terms, I will set out how much we have collected in the first 2 years of VAT, which is the gross revenue amount, how much VAT refunds have been generated in the same period, and the financial impact of the business license, property tax, and customs and excise duty reductions, which were part of the tax rebalancing initiatives accompanying the introduction of VAT. I will present the reduction in the deficit that has been facilitated by the additional VAT revenues in the context of our overall fiscal plan. To close out on the analysis, I will also highlight some of the social and other programs that have received increased funding during the last 2 years. Mr. Speaker, in the simplest terms, VAT revenue goes towards three things: tax reductions, funding of expenditure and deficit, and debt reductions being the residual outcome. So let me say it again. In simplest terms, VAT revenue goes towards three things: tax reductions, funding of expenditure, and deficit and debt reductions being the residual outcome. As I mentioned earlier, and as is detailed in Table A that will be submitted with this communication, a table, some $1.14 billion was collected in respect of the VAT in 2015 and 2016. Of this total, the Department of Inland Revenue collected $726 million, $316 million in 2015, and $410 million in 2016. The department also refunded some $20 million in VAT over these 2 years. The Department of Customs collected $415 million over the 2-year period, $209 million in 2015, and $207 million in 2016. Table B, which I'm submitting with this report, Table B sets out the details of VAT collections by month for both 2015 and 2016, delineated by source, namely from monthly filers, quarterly files, biannual filers, as well as VAT collected on conveyances and VAT collected at customs. A complete declaration of what any and everyone would want to see and read. As was explained above, since VAT introduction, the government has announced a number of tax relief measures which have naturally led to reductions in the recurrent government. In this context, I note that the first tax reduction announced was in respect of the hotel occupancy tax that we chose to eliminate at the introduction of VAT, since the latter would now be applicable to hotel accommodations, though at the lower rate of 7.5% rather than the previous 10%. So a net reduction, Mr. Speaker, to the hotel operators. With the elimination of the hotel occupancy tax, some $42.5 million in annual revenue has been foregone. And foregone means we gave it up. So remember, as I'm saying, concomitantly, as we introduce VAT, we are lowering other taxes. And in the case of the hotel occupancy, some $42.5 million in annual revenue was foregone for a 2-year period of roughly $85 million, or 7% of the total VAT collections. Mr. Speaker, with the implementation of VAT in January 2015, and with the financial year 2015-2016 budget implemented in July of 2015, the government began the process of paying back to Bahamians some portion of the dividends from our successful VAT regime, paying back to Bahamians as a result of VAT what some of the money we were collecting as a result of VAT, thereby, Mr. Speaker, providing much needed tax relief. Among the measures announced were a change in the calculation of customs duties from CIF, cost insurance freight, to FOB, free on board basis. The outright elimination of import duties on several items. Duty reductions on several other items. The maximum duty on motor vehicles was reduced from 85% to 65%. Duty exemptions under the Family Island Development Encouragement Act were extended for another year, and ABACO the east and west sections of Grand Bahama, Eleuthera, and Bimini were added to the list of qualifying areas. Duty concessions under the City of Nassau Revitalization Act were extended for another year. A reduction in the top property tax rates on owner-occupied residential properties from 0.75% to 0.625% was pronounced. More pronounced property tax relief for pensioners in middle-value properties also took place. A 10% discount for persons who pay property tax early each year was announced. A moratorium of 6 months for the waiver of real property tax surcharges on residential properties for persons who pay tax in full or make arrangements to do so, again announced. Harmonization of commercial property tax rates at a lower level of 0.75% also announced. A reduction in the maximum rate of business license fees from 1.75% to 1.5%, plus a reduction in rates of 0.75% for agricultural and fisheries operated businesses, food, meat. VAT registrants will be able to claim a credit for VAT on transfers, whereas they could not do so under the previous stamp tax regime. Mr. Speaker, in 2016-2017 budget, our efforts to provide additional tax relief for consumers, businesses, and property owners continued with the elimination and reduction of import and excise duties on a number of consumer goods and building materials, expansion of tariff concessions for light manufacturing, extension of duty exemptions under the Family Island Development Encouragement Act and the City of Nassau Revitalization Act for another year. Real property tax concessions granted to residential properties were extended to commercial properties, and real property tax arrears waivers were granted to owner-occupied properties under $250,000 in certain situations. Mr. Speaker, the highlights of the revenue foregone, or the revenue given up as a result of these tax relief measures are as follows. So you want to know where the money gone? Let's show you. Customs and excise duties 2015 and 2016, we gave up $86 million. Customs and excise duties 2015, $86 million, 2016, $48.9 million. That's the two. Change on the free on board for customs and excise duty calculations, 2015 and 2016. $60 million, Mr. Speaker, a cumulative amount. So far, we're giving up 86 million, 48.9 million, 60 million, VAT on conveyances under $100,000, 7 million. Real property tax rate changes, owner-occupied, 700,000. Residential, 500,000. Commercial, 2.5 million. Business license rate from 1.75% to 1.5%, we gave up $38.2 million. Real property tax waiver order under $250,000, we gave up $14 million. Real property tax amnesty, Mr. Speaker, doing things, $200,000. Real property tax pension or discount, $200,000, Mr. Speaker. Including the fiscal impact of the elimination of the hotel occupancy tax, $85 million, and VAT refunds, $20 million. The total reductions, Mr. Speaker, of tax foregone as a result of the introduction of VAT is $344 million in foregone revenue since we introduced VAT. Now, I want you to be able to factor that in. We promised that as VAT is introduced, we will begin the process of making it easier for all of the categories that I have been describing by giving up revenue and ultimately being able to arrive at a situation where Bahamians are not being forced to pay multiple levels of taxation. That is the process that we have embarked on. It is the process we articulated, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, VAT gross collections I say this. VAT gross collections over the 2-year period was $1.1 billion, but the net impact on revenue to the government was $756 million. So you're judging us not on $1.1 billion collected. You're judging us on $756 million. By any measure, Mr. Speaker, by any measure and any standard, a remarkable achievement while maintaining a stable economic environment. VAT was introduced without triggering a major economic contraction, despite all of the naysayers prognosticating about doom and gloom. This is worth repeating, Mr. Speaker. VAT was introduced without a recession. We had full compliance and cooperation from the private sector in introducing it. A stable economy has been maintained with the support of the private sector. Mr. Speaker, in order to gauge the deficit impact, it is necessary to begin by estimating the levels of GFS deficit that would have prevailed in the absence of the government's fiscal action since VAT introduction in January 2015. As such, we wish to consider the 3-year fiscal period from 2014-2015 to 2016-2017, which I would note includes the second half of this current fiscal year. We assume that in the absence of government fiscal action, the fiscal structure that my government inherited from the previous administration would have continued to operate in terms of the key indicators proportions to GDP. That is, recurrent expenditure at 20%, capital expenditure at 4.2%, and recurrent revenue at 16.3%. Debt redemption and nominal GDP are assumed to remain at their actual levels. On the basis of these assumptions, it is estimated that the GFS deficit over the 3-year fiscal period, 2014-2015, 2016-2017, would have averaged near $500 million per year, or a total of $1.5 billion. The actual average GFS deficit over the same period, placed at $337 million for a 3-year period, a total of $1 billion. Indeed, the latter estimates would have been significantly lower if we had not experienced weaker than expected economic growth and the 2 major hurricanes during this period. Using these assumptions, it can be concluded that the actions in the government's medium-term fiscal consolidation plan, which included the new VAT, net of other tax reductions and expenditure increases, have secured a reduction in the GFS deficit of near $500 million. This means that $500 million of the VAT revenue went to deficit reduction. Mr. Speaker, the residual amount that went towards expenditure is $256 million of the VAT revenue. In this respect, it is important to note that over the past 2 years, the government has also implemented additional funding for some of our important social and other public programs. The most significant funding focuses on areas such as national security, health, education, and social services. Since the implementation of VAT, the government has hired an additional 99 police officers at $1.782 million per annum during financial year 2015 to 2016. It has hired an additional 166 Defense Force officers at just under $3 million, $2,988,000 per annum during financial years 2015 to 2016 and 2016 to 2017. It has employed 347 more teachers and education support staff at $8,400,000 per annum, and it has hired 103 additional doctors and health professionals at $2,932,550 per annum. These vital expenditures would not be possible, Mr. Speaker, without VAT revenue. Let me say it again. The expenditures on police officers, defense force officers, doctors, teachers, which are a requirement to meet the modern needs of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, was greatly facilitated by the introduction of that, which gave the government, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity to be able to fund these, the expansion in these areas, which is vital to the governance of our country. Nor would it have been possible to service the debt associated with the acquisition of the vessels from the Royal Bahamas Defense Force at $25 million a year, or purchase a new immigration, border control, and passport system at a combined cost of $33 million, of which $5.8 million was paid in this fiscal year. Nor would it have been possible to purchase a new road traffic system at $8.3 million, of which $1.9 million has been paid off this fiscal year, and 4 new Doppler radars at $23 million, of which $7 million would be discharged this fiscal year. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in summary, 40% of the VAT revenue went towards reducing the deficit, 30% replaced revenue foregone from tax reductions, and the remaining 30% went towards general expenditures. These figures are included in Table C attached to this communication. The table and the accompanying graph is designed to give a layman a clear understanding that the VAT revenue is not frittered away, but goes directly towards improving the livelihood of Bahamians. Amen. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion of this communication, and as was stressed earlier in this communication, transparency and accountability are of fundamental and critical importance to modern democratic governance. Our citizens expect and rightfully deserve a full and clear accounting for the dollars and taxes that they pay to their government each and every year. Amen. In this respect, the government, that is, this government, has embarked on a project costing $33 million to enhance the financial reporting systems and to adopt modern accounting standards to further enhance the quality of information and the format of its presentation. That has actually contributed to greater transparency through a greater understanding of the Bahamian economy and the support in financing the improvements in reporting of financial information. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, it is evident from recent public discussions that there is a worrisome and counterproductive degree of misconception and misapprehension in respect of the public finances in our country and of the use of VAT revenues in particular. In our democracy, they must come to understand. Those who dumb down our country with dumbed down discussions and discourse must also be aware, Mr. Speaker, that they are undermining this country when they take such a simplistic approach to important issues of this country. This communication has sought to bring clarity to these matters with supporting data and in straightforward language. The ultimate objective is to enhance public understanding and appreciation of the extent to which transparency and accountability in our public finances are solidly embedded in the Constitution and laws of our nation. Every single dollar of revenue is fully accounted for each and every year and is subject to audit by the independent Auditor General. As such, Mr. Speaker, not $1 of VAT revenues collected over the past 2 years has been frittered away or spent surreptitiously. That is a grave and nonsensical misconception that once and for all must be put to rest. Our people deserve more from our leaders who are holding public meetings and discourse on this subject matter. Mr. Speaker, this communication has also reiterated the various objectives of revenue enhancement through VAT implementation and has highlighted with supporting data the extent to which VAT revenues have first facilitated additional government spending in priority areas and in response to adverse economic and natural events. Second, accommodated reductions in other major taxes for consumers, businesses, and property owners. And thirdly, directly contributed to significant reductions in the GFS deficit over the past 3 years. Put further in layman's terms, if I reduce the amount by which my expenditure exceeds my revenue, the less money, therefore, I have to borrow. This is a slowing of debt accumulation. As my revenues start to exceed my expenses, which are projected to take place in financial year 2018-2019, there would be an actual reduction in debt. However, to be clear, every year, Mr. Speaker, an element of expenditure is the servicing, repayment of government debt. And therefore, if the government has been able to repay debt without having to borrow as much, we are on the right fiscal trajectory. Mr. Speaker, I have made clear today that we believe it is the government's responsibility to explain as clearly as possible how the revenues that come into our government are utilized. This communication is one way of reaching out to the citizens of our country. We also are announcing today a new website, Mr. Speaker, understandingvat.org, where Bahamians can find the text of this communication, answers to the questions that occur most often in connection with VAT, as well as links to budget and other documents so that they can see for themselves the details of the tax relief, the deficit reduction, and the investments in our country that all have accompanied the introduction and implementation of VAT. Our nation has faced and continues to face important economic and social challenges. Through its Charter for Governance, Mr. Speaker, through its Charter for Governance, pursued during its current mandate, my government has demonstrated, Mr. Speaker, that it has the vision for the future and the action plans needed to improve the quality of life of Bahamians. A great deal of fundamental and needed change has been initiated and implemented over the past 5 years. The government is steadfastly dedicated to further pursuing and completing its change agenda in the period ahead. May God Almighty guide us along that path. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.